Chapter 12. 3 nights later, Lighton Crepsley took his first ever stage bow. Meletta sprang it on him at the last moment. He had been preparing his tray and smiled briefly as Meletta approached, expecting her to pass him by. When she stopped, he looked up, slightly annoyed. She knew he was working to a tight schedule, only to almost drop the tray with shock when she said, "Would you like to be part of my act tonight?" Lighton thought he must have misheard, but before he could ask Meletta to repeat herself, she said, "You won't have to do anything hard, just wriggle out of some locks and chains. It will be easy, if you're not scared, that is." She smirked, confident he wouldn't turn away from a challenge, but he nearly did, regardless of the shame it would bring him. "I can't," Lighton gasped. "I don't have anything to wear." Every performer had a specially designed costume. "I'm going to plant you," Meletta said. "You'll pretend to be a part of the crowd. I'll ask for a volunteer and pick you. That way you don't need a costume." Lighton tried to think of another objection, but Meletta headed him off at the pass again. "It was Hibernius's idea." "Mr. Tall wants me to go on," Lighton groaned. "He thinks you have what it takes. I do too, though I wouldn't have introduced you to the act this soon. I'd have given you another month, but Hibernius thinks you're ready, and he is rarely wrong in these matters." "All right," Lighton mumbled and set his tray aside. He didn't ask anyone to take it for him. He was sure Mr. Tall would have thought of that and sorted it out already. Lighton took a seat in the tent and chewed his fingernails as the rows around him filled. He felt dizzy and sick. He would have backed out if it had just been Meletta, but he was certain Mr. Tall was watching him. He didn't want to let down the man who had given him a temporary home. When the lights dimmed and the show began, Lighton could hardly breathe. The first few acts came and went without making any impression on him. Afterwards, he couldn't remember what the lineup had been. He sat chewing his nails or squeezing his hands, praying to the gods for a miracle. But Lighton's prayers went unanswered, and Meletta took to the stage as usual. She normally held back her chains for the second act, but mindful of what Lighton was going through, she opened with them that night. She performed a few tricks, slipping free of handcuffs and knotted ropes, and she stepped forward and asked if any young man would be so good as to come up and assist her. A few dozen hands shot into the air. Meletta's beauty ensured that she never went short of love-struck volunteers, but Lighton's wasn't among them. He had made a spur-of-the-moment decision to keep his hand down. Mr. Tall might criticize him later, but that was better than having to get up there and... To his amazement, his right arm shot into the air, and he half leapt out of his seat. He tried pulling his hand down, but he was no longer in control of the limb. "There we go," Meletta cried. "You'll do. Young sir, give him a warm round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen. He's a brave young man, isn't he?" As people clapped and cheered politely, Lighton found himself edging forward, propelled, he was sure, by the magic of the unseen Mr. Tall. About halfway to the stage, he regained control, but it was too late to back out. Gulping, he mounted the steps and grinned crookedly as Meletta turned him to face the crowd. There were so many of them. Lighton had viewed audiences from the wings and moved among them with his wares, but now that they were staring at him, he realized for the first time how tightly packed in they were. He saw hunger in their eyes. They wanted to be entertained and would be merciless if they were denied their sport. Their lives were short and hard. This was a rare chance to escape to a more fantastical world, and they would shower abuse on anyone who disappointed them. As Lighton's knees trembled, Meletta stroked his cheek and said, "I think he's shy." There were catcalls, and some people roared at Lighton to kiss her. He felt even more nervous now than he had felt in his seat. As Lighton thought about fleeing, Meletta grabbed his wrist and pinned them behind his back. He yelped as she snapped handcuffs on them and forced him to his knees. There were lots of cheers. The crowd liked it when their stars played rough. "Will I make this young fool beg for freedom?" Meletta crowed. "Yes!" the audience screamed. "Will I make him crawl on his stomach like a toad and kiss my feet?" "Yes!" "Will I—" "You'll do nothing!" Lighton snarled, snatching her arm and dragging himself to his feet. In his anger, he'd picked the lock of the handcuffs and tossed them aside. Squaring up to Meletta, he steadied himself to deliver a foul curse. Before he could, Meletta gasped theatrically. "I was sure I locked those cuffs," she called to the crowd. "Maybe there's more to this boy than I thought." Lighton hesitated as a few of the people, mostly ladies who felt sorry for him, clapped half-heartedly. He was glowering at Meletta, but he sneaked a sideways glance and saw that the hunger in the eyes of the crowd had been replaced with mild curiosity. Meletta took Lighton's arms and bent them behind his back again, but this time she was more gentle, and he didn't resist. He kept still as she bound him with ropes and another pair of handcuffs, then turned so that the audience could see. "There!" she exclaimed. "That will hold him." She spun Larden so he was facing the crowd again. "Now, what should I do with him?" A few of the men shouted suggestions. As they yelled, Larden worked quickly, loosening the ropes and picking the lock. As Merletta considered the cries of the crowd, Larden slipped free, tapped Merletta on the shoulder and coughed slightly. Merletta gave a shriek, as if taken by surprise. Larden held up his hands and smiled. The audience applauded enthusiastically, accepting him as a performer, and the rest of the show flew by smoothly after that. Larden felt like he was dreaming. He didn't want the act to end. He cherished every laugh and clap from the crowd. He wasn't up there with Merletta more than 3 or 4 minutes, but when he later looked back at his time and broke it down into every delicious second and thrill, it would seem to him as if he'd been on stage for an hour. Larden relished his moment in the spotlight and couldn't understand why he had ever been scared. He had never been drunk, but he figured this must be what it felt like. It was as if he owned the world and could do no wrong. Larden left the stage to a huge round of applause. The crowd had taken a liking to him and were pleased for his sake. They could see that he was a newcomer and that this meant a lot to him. Larden would never forget that wonderful feeling. It was a special moment in his life, and he drew all the happiness from it that he could. Mr. Tall was waiting in the wings as Larden made his exit. The giant nodded to show his satisfaction. "You did well," he murmured. Larden beamed in response, his thoughts 100 miles high. "But now you have a more mundane, but equally important job to do." Mr. Tall angled his head to the left and Larden saw his tray, waiting on the table for him. "Oh," Larden said, his smile fading slightly. "I thought—" "No resting your hands on laurels around here," Mr. Tall said. Larden had never heard that expression before, so Mr. Tall translated it for him. "No sitting around on your backside. You had your moment of glory. Bravo. I am pleased it went well, but you must not let yourself get carried away. There will be other nights and better performances, but now you must earn your keep. It is our way." "Of course," Larden said, putting his child's disappointment behind him. He was glad Seba hadn't seen him act so vainly. Picking up the tray, he waited for the next act to finish, then wound his way through the crowd. He smiled when people said something nice or slapped his back, but he also stayed focused on his job and sold steadily, like a true professional. There was a party later that night. They held parties regularly at the Cirque du Freak. The celebrations served as a reward for the hard-working staff and stars. But they were also a chance for Mr. Tall to invite influential people from the towns and villages near where they performed. While there was no law against a freak show, such restrictions would not come into play until the next century. Life was easier if you kept a certain breed of man happy. It was better to flatter than annoy people with money and power. Larden had always been shy at events like this. He normally kept to the sides, serving drinks and food, avoiding conversation. But tonight he was on a high. It helped that some of the guests recognized him from his stint on the stage, and paused to commend his efforts. He even got chatting to a few young ladies, who smiled at him and shot him sly looks that the innocent boy missed completely. Larden was able to learn the ways of magic quickly, but it would be a long time before he learnt much about women. He tried to sleep after the party, but he was agitated and couldn't keep his eyes shut. He kept flashing back to his time on stage, wishing he could have done more, trying to decide what he would do the next time he was up there. Since sleep was proving elusive, Larden got up to watch the sunrise. He beamed as daylight crept across the world, warming the earth and waking the animals and birds. He considered going back to bed, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Besides, it had been a long time since he'd been abroad at so early an hour. It would be nice to go for a stroll and watch the world come to life. Mr. Tolo had set up camp close to several towns and a scattering of villages. People would travel many miles for a performance of the legendary Cirque du Freak, but the owner tried to make things easy as possible for them. Larden skirted the homesteads, preferring the countryside. He smiled as he walked, as if the cattle and sheep he passed were old friends. He spotted a fox on its way home. He could have stalked and caught it, but there was no need. Seba would be feasting in the halls of Vampire Mountain, and the cupboards and barrels at the circus were always well stocked. Larden wove his way along paths and through forests for a few hours before pausing to rest. He sat on a hill overlooking a village and soaked up the sunlight. He was hungry, so he looked for a shop or inn where he might be able to buy food. As Larden was studying the village, he spotted a handful of people scurrying towards a tiny church. A few more tore along after them less than a minute later. Larton's interest was aroused. This wasn't a holy day, and even if it had been, the people hadn't looked as if they were on their way to a service. They looked scared. Larton trotted down the hill. A few more villagers hurried along and passed him on the street. None spared him a glance, even though a stranger would have drawn curious stares on any normal day. He paused at the door of the church. He could hear angry muttering and weeping from within. He had a bad feeling about this. Perhaps it would be better if he didn't enter. Larton would have retreated, except a family of 4 children and their parents pushed up behind him while he was dithering, the father carrying the smallest child and looking wild. "Go on," the man snapped. "Get the door." Larton pulled the door open and stood back as the man and children brushed by. He still might have turned away if the woman hadn't waved him in. She looked on the verge of tears, and Larton didn't want to upset her, so he stole in ahead of her and let her close the doors behind him. Larton's unease increased inside the church. He hadn't been in one since he'd become Seba's assistant. Vampires had their own gods, and although Larton didn't know much about them, he knew that he was finished with the religions of humanity. But that wasn't the reason for his discomfort. He could see that these people were distraught. Many were crying. Others were cursing and striding around like caged wolves, snapping at their neighbours or the empty air. A group of men stood at the centre of the church, in front of the altar, huddled close as if they were protecting something. A few women and children approached them, but they turned back with angry gestures. Larton found himself drawn to the group as if hypnotized. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as if this church had been lying in wait for him, as if he had business here that couldn't be avoided. The men close to the altar stared suspiciously at Larton as he drew near. He could see them silently debating whether to let the stranger step among them or drive him back like the other youths. Larton straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the men, neither slowing nor speeding up. As he came level, a couple shrugged and stepped aside so that he could slip between them. Larton found a boy beyond the men, his own age or a bit younger. The boy was kneeling in the middle of 4 bodies, a man, a woman, and 2 children, that were laid out on the floor, arms crossed neatly over their chest. The boy was rocking backwards and forwards, moaning softly, his hands outstretched and blood-stained. One lay on the forehead of the man, the fingers of the other stroked the cheek of the woman. The man, woman, and children were dead, and Larton could see that they'd been murdered. Their throats had been slashed open. He also saw by the small amount of blood around their necks and the pale shade of their faces that the killer had drunk from them. No, even worse than that. They had been drained.